undeniable teleplasmic shit?
Hey everyone, welcome back to Underrated, a podcast where we discuss underrated films or ones that have slipped under the radar or passed most people by. I am one of your co-hosts, Derek McDuff, and with me as always are Ariel Ortiz.
Hello.
Alan Torres.
Hey everybody, what's going on?
And we have a special guest joining us from Podcast Like It's 1999, the creator of Fox's Sleepy Hollow, Phil Iscove. How's it going, Phil? Thank you so much for joining us.
Guys, I appreciate it. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you. So the film we're going to be talking about today is 1996's The Frighteners, which was directed by Peter Jackson. I believe it was the last film he did before The Lord of the Rings, directed by him and co-written by him along with his partner Fran Walsh, starring, of course, Michael J. Fox and an ensemble of really great character actors from the 90s. But yeah, this is kind of a horror, comedy, drama, supernatural thriller. It's a lot of stuff.
It's the perfect mix.
Yeah, it's kind of a perfect kind of cult classic, but very 90s cult movie. But Phil was the one who suggested this to us. I know it's a big favorite of Alan and Ariel's as well. But Phil, I want to kick it to you first. You're the guest, so you get to go first. Tell us why you chose this movie and why you like it so much.
Well, I mean, truthfully, it's kind of funny because there's a confluence of things going on in my life right now in the sense that I'm currently a project that was inspired in a lot of ways by this film. It's kind of a goth Buffy is the best way to kind of describe it, I guess, for NBC that I'm doing with Justin Lin's company. And so I wanted to rewatch this film. I had seen it, a few years ago, and I've always loved it. I think that it is sort of a as is your podcast, underrated and underseen. I think it's a film that a lot of people probably don't really know about. It didn't do very well in '96. Unfortunately, Universal sort of overshot with this and put it out in the summer when they should have put it out in October. They thought they had a bigger hit on their hands than it turns out that they did. If this film came out in October, I think that this film probably would have done at least a third as well as it did. But I also feel like it's sort of an atypical Michael J. Fox performance as well in a lot of ways. I don't think that people sort of think of him like this. It's a pretty dark performance. He's not really kind of playing or leaning into the Michael Fox isms as much in this film. I think there's a lot of things that I love about it. It's also funny because I've been rewatching Sam Raimi's films for the Blank Check podcast, which I'm a big fan of. And watching Evil Dead and this, it's hard not to see a little bit a mirroring going on there, to say the least. This has a very Sam Raimi kind of vibe. I think the entire film is shot with a wide angle lens, so the whole thing is like fish-eyed and crazy, and the camera's constantly moving, and it's just a really sort of dynamic film. So yeah, I mean, I also think that I've been listening to the score a lot. It's a score that you can't find anywhere. I had to buy the CD used on eBay for $40. But it is one of my favorite Danny Elfman scores as well. He was a fan of, I think, Meet the Feebles and Heavenly Creatures, and just said that he would do whatever Peter Jackson was doing sight unseen next. And obviously it was a good marriage. But yeah, I mean, there's just, I think it's a really fun, kind of fucked up, weird movie. We'll talk about, obviously, some of the specific moments that I think on this rewatch certainly jumped out at me, and sort of maybe explained why this film didn't make much of a hit at the box office. But
yeah, because it did. Yeah, I was just looking at how much it made, and it only made about $3 million more than the budget. And I didn't know that it was, that much of almost a bomb, I guess. And it's always been one of those movies that's been kind of on the periphery for me. I remember vaguely watching it on like Comedy Central, like late night one time. Like I was like, oh yeah, like the premise intrigued me so much of like it's a movie where Michael J. Fox can see ghosts, and he just uses that to be like a shady con man. And I thought that was really interesting. But I don't know, let me kick it to, I don't know, Ariel or Alan, whichever you guys want to take, because you guys, I think, have a lot more history with the movie than I do.
Yeah, I would mind. Yeah, for me, this was actually, I think, one of my first memories of Michael J. Fox is, seeing him in anything. And so for me, this was like the epitome of Michael J. Fox, and I just enjoyed the hell out of this movie. I got introduced to it by my parents. I don't think we might have seen it in theaters, but I don't remember it until like we rented it and watched it. And it's just such I still to this day enjoy the heck out of this movie, and like I enjoy all the character actors. This was the first time that I caught on, oh, this is like a Peter Jackson film and stuff like that. And then he's plays like one of the background actors in one of the scenes. He's the man with the piercings that Michael J. Fox like bumps into before he gets hit by the hearse. And then yeah,
best cameo since Hitchcock, I think he's got.
Yeah, and yeah, and then so it was also very interesting of like, oh, so that's why Sean Astin like is in Lord of the Rings. That might be one of the reasons why Sean Astin like is Samwise, because his father, John Astin, aka the OG Gomez Adams, is in this movie as well.
Sure.
Yeah, and I just always have like found it so interesting of like the ghosts and his interactions with them. And then yeah, he is a con man, but then at the same time he's like doing this because he's so guilt ridden because of his wife, and then how his mind got essentially blocked from that memory, and all he remembers is just like that his wife got like a number carved into his thing. And then you get to see further and further like he has like a lot more abilities than you initially thought. Like, yes, he could talk to goats, but then he also has like premonitions towards the end. And the twist was always like pretty interesting with the how the girl was an accomplice, because like you have that whole beginning scene of her being chased by this what they think is the ghost of death, but ends up being Johnny Bartlett, and this serial killer. And so you as a viewer very much believe this story until like the switch happens, and you do believe that the mother actually had something to do with it, or like covered up something. And then you have that twist of the the daughter essentially like still carrying on this relationship, and essentially bringing her ex or her dead boyfriend back from the grave, because all the murders started back up 5 years ago when she was released, and I guess brought him back with the Ouija board.
I mean, I think that some of it is, the casting of Dee Wallace, who is someone obviously, plays the mom in E.T., and, Peter Jackson talked a lot about how testing was. You don't really suspect it. You don't suspect her to be associated with these murders, and it's a nice shoot up at the end.
Yeah, and then Jake Busey just like really much like getting the craziness from his father and using
there
it to
ever
his
been
advantage.
A serial killer cast so well as Jake Busey in this movie? Like he could be playing any part, and I'm like, this guy's definitely killed some people.
Yeah,
he's in Contact, I believe, the previous summer, or maybe it might have even been the next summer. It's like it's very close, and I'm just like, he really had like a lane for a second there where he was just like the go-to kind of lunatic, and then for whatever reason, and then like Starship Troopers, like, in a bunch of stuff around that time, and then he just kind of disappears.
Yeah, no, he still plays the loon really well. Like the most notable, like recently, was a Rooster Teeth production called Day 5, that he would like knock that out of the park. Is just like this sleep deprived, like crazy ass like a soldier and stuff like that. But yeah, the Buseys, they just like I don't think Jake Busey is actually crazy, but he does it very well. um, but yeah, and it's such a I love the like this relationship that kind of like gets formed between Michael J. Fox's character and then the doctor and how it's very natural and gradual and even though like this movie is kind of short, it does I think actually take place over the course of like a few weeks at least or at least like a couple months and stuff and then yeah, like going back to that, you have all these awesome character actors with like John Aston, and then the what I know specifically as just Gunny, like he's always the Gunny sergeant, in
Oh, Arlie
everything.
Emery. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, Arlie, yeah. And then Chi McBride is awesome in it, and like, and I just love that friendship that Michael J. Fox has with these ghosts and how like they know that they're being used in a way and like they want to be better. And he's like, well, guys, like you're dead. Like what else I can't do much for you. And like all this bickering and stuff. And yeah, I've always loved this movie. And yeah, that's why like I don't understand why. Because for me, like I thought it was popular because like I got introduced to it as a kid. So to know that it was, not as well received, and then of course like it I guess fell into the same kind of hitch as Hocus Pocus, unfortunately, where it got released as a summer movie where it definitely should have been released as a Halloween movie. So
Mhm.
which is why the 90s didn't know how to market things sometimes.
Ultimately, it was. I think it was a mixture of a couple things. Zemeckis produced this film, so and he's probably at the top of his game at this point. It's post Forrest Gump, it's right before Contact, and I just feel as though Universal must have thought, well, we got a Zemeckis hit on our hands here, but this movie is just much more specific. It's Peter Jackson's voice is very different from Robert Zemeckis's. Like they don't really speak to each other. You know what I mean? So there's
Yeah.
kind of a weird sort of, I think, Universal just getting over their skis and thinking they had a bigger hit than they did. But anyway,
Yeah, they're like Zemeckis and Michael J. Fox. We've made a lot of money on these guys
Makes
before.
sense,
Let's do
yeah.
it again.
right, exactly, yeah.
Like I didn't know he produced it. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, okay, that explains a lot. Like that makes a lot of sense.
But yeah, if I can jump in, I definitely dug this movie a lot. I loved it. No love for the reanimator himself, Jeffrey Combs. I know he was an absolute creep in this movie, but you gotta love him, man. He's great. I love reanimators, so seeing him in this is always a pleasure. Yeah, and funny enough, the first time I saw this was in the '90s, obviously, and it was on Fox. I remember Fox would always show movies like Thursday nights or something, and I remember they showed it. Which I saw. I'm another big fan of Sleepy Hollow as well that I also saw on Fox. So big ups to that. Thank you for that.
Thank
It
you,
was
thank you.
wonderful. But yeah, no, I kind of got introduced to a lot of horror in the '90s because of Fox, and they would do that like Thursday night showing, and that's how I got to see Scream and Scream 2, and Frighteners was another one of my biggest things that they would replay and I would love. But yeah,
They're probably coming off of like X-Files, and they just rode that wave, from
Mhm.
X-Files.
I think too was like they just didn't have anything. They're like, well, Ally McBeal, that their season's over. Let's throw something else on. So yeah, so I definitely love it. I definitely loved it, and the story's fun. I really dug like the whole con man exorcist thing, and I was in the '90s. I would just rewatch Back to the Future religiously, the trilogy. So that was always a pleasure to watch Michael J. Fox. But I actually was terrified of this movie growing up. Like,
Oh yeah.
Josh Homme. I mean, Jake Busey. Another thing, I always thought that Josh Homme from Queens of the Stone Age was Jake Busey's character. I have no idea why. And then how you were saying that he was the Starship Troopers, and he kind of disappeared. And then as a kid, I was just like, Well, he went to go do Queens of the Stone Age, so makes sense. That's why. So for like until like the 2000s, I was like, oh, they're different people. Oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
scared too. Like the scene that always scared me as a kid was the reveal of that this is Johnny Bartley with like goop and then the face like that gets slapped and his face like changes and stuff like that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that me too. That was the scene that freaked me out. I like absolutely had nightmares. Like I'd hide behind like the couch, like every time it'd pop up. I was like, oh fuck. And then just his big grim reaper visage is like terrifying. Like especially when he's like jumping across like rooftops and it just like freaked me out because I would look out the window and I'm like, oh my god, is he out there like ready to like choke my heart out? And yeah, and
It
I
is a
love
pretty fucked up
miniatures.
movie. It
Oh
definitely
yeah,
is. Yeah, I mean, it certainly it is interesting too because it does feel like you know Peter Jackson did much more upsetting movies previous to this, right? I mean, Meet the Feebles, Heavenly Creatures. His earlier stuff is much more sort of raw and horrific. So like it's clear that this is him trying to make like an accessible studio movie. At the same time, it's also like there's just imagery in it that is very haunting. It definitely stays with you.
absolutely. And then I mean, didn't he also do Brain Dead, Dead Alive as well?
Yeah.
Which
Yep.
is
Yep.
just fucking bonkers. So there's that. If anybody hasn't seen it, go out check it out. It's a lot. Probably one of the goriest films of all time. But yeah, no, definitely, it's super haunting, man. Yeah, and I kind of I'm a big true crime guy, so I'm kind of a sucker for serial killers. So I'm just like, yep, makes sense. Bring them back. They want to finish the job. They want to keep going. So yeah, definitely. I love that big twist too that they were together, and then now over time, kind of learning it, I'm like, yep, makes sense. There's always accomplices, and there's always something there that a lot of people don't know that. Yeah, some serial killers have that accomplice, and it's always like I like how Jeffrey Combs' character brings it up with like Charles Manson and the family. I feel like that was a little bit of a foreshadowing too, to be like, hey, like there's something else along the way that you're like, oh, Charles Manson didn't do everything all himself. It was, he had his whole family, the family, and then that was a little kind of way of telling the audience like, hey, it's not completely just this Grim Reaper guy, so kind of keep an eye out. But yeah, man, definitely a lot of fun. It was awesome, and then just like you say, a lot of Sam Raimi influence. Um, that with the shots, there was a shot where Michael J. Fox is in the prison cell, and Jeffrey Combs is talking, and like all the funny camera angles are on Jeffrey Combs, and then Michael J. Fox's camera angles are just so strict and like just kind of not moving, just to kind of show you the big difference of it, which I really dug a lot. And then miniatures, practical effects, big sucker for, especially when it's zooming down very Sam Raimi when like the arrows coming at you or something like a weapon or something. A lot of fun, but yeah.
Yeah. And well, you bring up like that it's very Raimi-esque, and I feel like there's a lot of influences that you can see with kind of like quote unquote like classic horror, classic even like proto slashers and stuff like that pop up in this. Like obviously there's a lot of homages to Psycho being in like the house with the mom and like, oh, the mom is crazy and stuff. And then there's like even the picture that's on Letterboxd is like the Michael J. Fox looking through the door exactly like The Shining. And it just feels like Peter Jackson, kind of like Sam Raimi, they had very similar career arcs where they started out being these kind of low budget guys making these kind of like grimy horror movies that were like cult hits, like that would get passed around, like, oh my god, have you seen Evil Dead? Have you seen Dead Alive? Have you like get passed around? And then in the very early 2000s, they both had huge success with big studio trilogies, and it's interesting to see kind of now Peter Jackson is still kind of one of those big guys, but Sam Raimi, he's kind of like gone away from that. He doesn't do a lot of stuff anymore.
To date now, to date
Doing a Marvel
today,
movie. Yeah.
yeah, to date
Yeah,
today,
Marvel
he
movie.
has combined both of his talents, and
That's true.
and
That's
it
true.
took me 2 hours to get those tickets. So,
I think
I
that
was
Raimi
like,
definitely. I mean, I think that "Drag Me to Hell" was,
Mm.
obviously a script he'd been working on for a really long time, and I think a lot of that, which I absolutely love, and didn't get the love that it deserved in '09.
which
Mhm.
is why
didn't
we
do
covered
that
it.
well in theaters. I think that people
Mhm.
just didn't really know what to do with it. Um, I think it's a fantastic movie, and listen, I'm excited to see what he does with Doctor Strange. I'm excited that he's back in he's making movies. Like I don't really care necessarily what it is. I'm just excited to see what he has to do. Peter Jackson, on the other hand, I mean, he kind of got unfortunately pulled
Mhm.
back into the Hobbit movies, which
Mhm.
if any legitimacy to to the stuff you've read, he didn't really want to do them. I mean, it was really almost a contractual obligation at a certain point. When Del Toro pulled out of them, it sort of kind of landed in his lap. And it's not that they're terrible movies by any stretch of the imagination, but it does feel like you're sort of like, this guy doesn't want to do six of these. Like he's
Mhm.
just
Oh yeah.
so I do wonder whether or not and then with the Lovely Bones not being very good, it does feel like he's kind of lost the thread a little bit, unfortunately.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think like he just kind of wants to make documentaries now. Like, people love
What?
the Beatles one. He did that World War I one that
Yeah.
I didn't see either. But like, I think he's just kind of like, all right, well, I have been so bogged down. I think, these guys who have like struggle for years and then they get this big success and then they're kind of like, oh, I just kind of have to do this now. They're like, okay, like they maybe need a break for a little bit. And I think that's why Raimi took a little bit off, went back, did his Drag Me to Hell. Peter Jackson is doing his docs now. And you can see it, and I
Did
think you bring up an interesting point.
yeah.
No, what were you gonna say, Phil?
I was just gonna say he did produce Mortal Engines, and I think he kind of shadow directed a lot of that as well,
Oh yeah.
which I
Which
kind
I kind
of
of love, honestly.
I did too. I'll kind of ride for Mortal Engines, quite frankly.
Mm.
I kind of dug that movie quite often, but yeah, it does feel as though it's funny watching this film the other day. I did find myself just really wishing that Peter Jackson, like when The Lovely Bones was announced, I was like, oh wow, like this is him going back to his heavenly
Mhm.
creatures, right? Like this is him going back to sort of like his kind of obsession with like the ideas of heaven and hell and what an afterlife looks like and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh cool, but unfortunately, like Lovely Bones, after you've been making Lord of the Rings movies, like I think I'm not sure Peter Jackson can go back to being a small $20 million filmmaker anymore.
Yeah,
Mm.
Mm.
yeah, exactly. And then he had, between those two, he also had King Kong, which is like, I think there's a really good 2-hour movie in King Kong. It's just, God, that's a long movie. Like,
Oh yeah.
and I feel the same way about the Hobbit films. I'm like, if that was like one movie or even two, I think that the Hobbit movies would be pretty solid. But like when you have that whole like the last 30 minutes of the second one are just like a Benny Hill sketch, I'm just like I can't. So I feel like he's just maybe just reined back a little bit. Just a little bit of just overindulgence, and it's
Well,
I
I
think
think that was
the
more so the studios part, like very much so, like movie studios back then a role in that time when it was trilogy after trilogy of books after books. They kind of wanted to pull it out, and the only
yeah, because
because
it was shot as two films, and
It
they
was
were like,
supposed to be
Mhm.
hold
two
on, you got to make a
originally.
third one. Yeah.
Oh. Well, I even then I would argue like to do it one, because like source material wise it fits as one story, and I think that's why the Lord of the Rings ones are so masterpieces, because essentially the majority of the elements in there are from the books, and it's had to be like removing things to make it work, whereas like the Hobbits was adding things. But yeah, I think Peter Jackson hopefully like will be able to like kind of regain his desire and or his passion. I don't know if I would hope it's still there somewhere, because yeah, he is an incredible filmmaker and storyteller. Is like this, him co-writing the Frighteners here, and it is something that very well missed, and I really do hope that he can come up with, because I don't agree. I think he could create an indie film, and I think that might be the best thing for him, because like indie films allow a lot of creativity, and I think hopefully with his his good status with coming out of the Lord of the Rings, which will probably last his whole career, he has that ability to kind of make those small movies as well. And I think that's something that we're seeing in recent years of big time directors probably like taking a step back and having that ability. Like I know that in the last episode we recorded, we kind of like discussed about how Netflix and Apple TV and all these other streaming services kind of backing these movies, kind of like allowing for a little bit more of a creative freedom and a place to kind of like place these like passion projects from all these different filmmakers and writers. So I think I would hope that he comes back with something like that and yeah.
You know, I don't think that Peter Jackson has a lack of freedom. I mean, I think he can kind of do whatever he wants. I think the question is more about whether or not he's able to do something smaller. And I don't even mean necessarily budget wise, but just in terms of like what film. One of the many things I love about this film is that it's really just pretty clean. It's not overly complicated for the most part. It's a pretty straight storyline and just delineated really well. It's an hour 45. It's not particularly long. It's just a really tight, well-oiled story. It's a spooky story. It's a fairy tale kind of thing, and he's very, very good at that. And I just wonder. I mean, Peter Jackson can clearly do whatever the hell he wants, and I think that he hasn't made a film. I mean, a narrative film in a while. I think the last one was Hobbit films, if I'm not mistaken. I think that those were the last time that he's done a narrative film. I really believe that the guy doesn't have a bunch of other things that he'd love to do, passion projects, books, whatever the case might be. And I hope that he finds his fastball again, because there was kind of no one like him when he was doing what he was doing. And if like you were saying, Derek, he needs to replenish, revitalize whatever it is by doing documentaries or figuring out what it is that he wants to be saying. I'm excited to see whatever he has to do. But in terms of this particular film, I watching it again, a bunch of things kind of hit me. The first is, I don't know if you guys know, but it was supposed to be a part of an anthology of horror films that Zemeckis was doing for, I believe it was Showtime at the time, Tales from the Crypt. So it was going to be an episode of Tales of the Crypt.
Ooh.
And then when he read the script for it, he's like, this is ultimately too good to be just an episode of Tales of the Crypt. We should do this as a film. Zemeckis at that point had seen Heavenly Creatures, and that sort of was the moment. Heavenly Creatures is a masterpiece. If you haven't seen Heavenly Creatures, everyone should go out and watch it right now, especially with Melanie Lynskey killing it on Yellow Jackets. Everyone should be watching everything that Melanie Lynskey does. Her last name being said a million times in this film because what's her name? The main character's last name is Linsky, so they say like Dr. Linsky a million times. But it's just interesting to see how Zemeckis smartly, from a producerial perspective, seeing that there was just more to do with this, and that this story deserved to be given more money. And then you mentioned the Grim Reaper and those special effects, which at the time were groundbreaking special effects, which hold up pretty well, all things considered. I mean, 96 was a long time ago, but when that Grim Reaper comes out of the mirror in the bathroom, it looked fucking awesome. Like, it still looks really, really cool. So and that mixture of practical and special effects. I mean, Weta, this was basically one of Weta's first things that they did, which is, obviously Peter Jackson's special effects house. It really is sort of a groundbreaking movie, and I feel like a lot of people haven't seen it. I think that it's just kind of this weird little movie that kind of exists. But I think that I really do feel like the tone of this movie is bizarre. Like, it's really trying to be a comedy and I mean, in a lot of ways, it is doing kind of what Evil Dead did a little bit. It's not as gory as Evil Dead, but like Evil Dead 2 is trying to be kind of like cartoonishly playful while at the same time being a horror movie. This movie has like a ghost element in it, which feels a little Beetlejuicy, which I obviously, if you don't love Beetlejuice, I don't know what to tell you, but whatever. But I think it's a masterpiece. But I think that the ghosts in this have this really interesting. Not really sure I understand the rules necessarily of how they interact with our world and their world. I'm not really sure I understand why like they chopped up into pieces, or there's like all kinds of weird shit going on. Like they kind of feel like a Looney Tunes characters in the sense that like they can have all this weird shit happen to them and they can also interact with our world. But all that being said, I think it all looks great. I think that there are jokes that I think in hindsight I might not have put in this movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the judge having sex with the thing in the sarcophagus, and
Yeah, I was like, is
like
it
when
necrophilia if they're both dead?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it's
or the line that he says,
the
"I like
line,
it when
yeah.
they lay still like that." Where I'm just like,
yeah.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
that was gross. That was
Yeah.
bad. Also, did
There's
you notice
just
that
somewhere
the
like
judge
that.
isn't in heaven at the end? And I was like, is that the reason?
Probably.
Why doesn't the
yeah.
judge go to heaven?
It's probably
Maybe because
because
of that. I
Asked
don't
him
know.
that
he was
day. It's
he was a
possible.
hanging judge. He's not going to heaven. He just like yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why he was very much a morally gray character.
Sorry, didn't mean to derail you there, Phil.
Yeah, sorry.
And the effects are great. Like I love the makeup effects that he has as a ghost with like his jawbone coming out of his mouth, like all this kind of stuff where it's like it's really. And this movie was rated R, which Peter Jackson still to this day is like, I don't know why this one was rated. Like it really, you don't see very much. Like it's not a particularly gory film, really. I think it was just the overall vibe of it was just the MPA. It was just like this is too intense and there's too much going on and we don't know how to deal with all of this. But I mean, I guess it is. I mean. At the sanatorium is pretty fucked up.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in this day and age, it would hit a PG-13. Like it takes a lot to do
Yeah,
a
I'm really
R-rated
surprised,
movie,
honestly. That
but
I did
yeah,
not
and
know
then-
that. That's surprising.
yeah, yeah, and then even if it was like back then in the 90s, like to me being a child, like in the 90s and stuff, definitely there was a lot of more stigma towards R-rated movies. And yeah, that's very much surprising that my parents allowed me to watch it, which some R-rated movies like slipped through the cracks with my family. But yeah, that I know that definitely in the 90s there was a very bigger stigma towards R-rated movies. As now, this day and age, like Disney with Disney Plus is on the cusp of like allowing R-rated movies on their Disney platform, and it's like essentially, yeah, leaving it up to the parents, which it should be. But yeah, that probably is another reason why it kind of didn't get as much reception as it should have.
Yeah, I do. I think the R rating definitely hurt its box office. I think again, an R-rated film coming out at Halloween has a better shot of people going out to see it. An R-rated film coming out I think this movie came out in July, if I'm not mistaken, it is just sort of like, what are we doing right now? It was a choice, to say the least. I'm sure Universal, if they could do it again, wouldn't. Yes.
And what really cracks me up about it is that this movie, it didn't really deserve, like, I felt like it could have been a hard PG-13. And then I like that the next year we get Spawn, which is a big horror comic book adaptation, and you think, okay, that movie definitely needs to be rated R. And they're like, no, let's bring it down to PG-13. And it's like, why? You want that? And even then, there's so many scenes with, like, Violator just absolutely terrifying. And I was like, this should be rated R. Like, just go full ham. Like, yeah.
It's interesting, too, because, like, I mean, the R-rated blockbuster, for all intents and purposes, is a pretty small list. It's, more times than not, studios are convinced that it's not worth going down that road unless they have to. I mean, The Matrix, obviously, in the late 90s and the early 2000s was a big deal. And then, obviously, you look at Deadpool recently, and although now the third one's going to be PG-13, so... it's anyone's guess, really. I mean, I think that, listen, this is a risk-adverse industry. I understand that it's a lot of money spent on these projects, and to release something in theaters, especially, we were talking earlier about the streaming thing and the whole theatrical experience is incredibly expensive. To market a film and release it in theaters, people don't realize just how expensive an endeavor that is. So now with streaming being an option, I think you're going to see the riskier materials most likely heading towards streaming, and the safer bets, going in theaters.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it just you guys talking about like how the R-rated movies, especially in the 90s, were such a big risk, and you didn't really have a lot of, other than Keanu Reeves movies, rated R big blockbusters. And it just kind of reminds me of, I was definitely, not allowed to see rated R movies in the early 90s when I was pretty young. My parents were very, very overprotective. And so I remember, speaking of Keanu Reeves, I was not allowed to see Speed because it was rated R. However, Speed 2 was rated PG-13. So I got to watch Speed 2 and Willem Dafoe and The Boat, and I was like, people were like, oh, this is nowhere near as good as the first one. For me, though, the only movie I'd seen of the Speed franchise was Speed 2, and I was like, what are you talking about? This movie's kick-ass. Like, I love Speed 2. But yeah, so I get...
That movie is not kick-ass.
No, it's definitely not. I haven't seen it since probably, 1995 or whatever. But yeah.
Even Sandra Bullock shits on that movie.
Yep.
My tastes are a little more refined now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Watching this film the other day, I was thinking about whether or not this film would get made today. I mean, listen, if Peter Jackson wanted to make this film today, this movie gets made for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of, the budget for this film back in 96, forgive me, I think was in the 60s or 70s, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it was only like 25 million for the budget.
Okay, so there you go. In 96, that would be 60 million today,
Mm-hmm.
basically. So, to give someone $60 million today, I mean, the only that are kind of doing that are your A24s. You know what I mean? Like looking at The Northman, which comes out, on the 22nd, and Robert Eggers being given $90 million to make a crazy Viking movie is fucking rad.
Mhm.
And I'm excited to see it. But, it's kind of the only people that are doing it is, giving that kind of money to auteurs. So I guess we should just be lucky that anybody's doing it.
Mhm.
But it is, that's their lane,
Yeah.
right? I mean, A24 has decided that they're going to be the place where auteurs go to make weird movies that they might make money.
Yeah, them and Netflix, I feel like, are like the only mid-budget games in town. Like everything else is just like X, where it's like a couple $1 million, or it's just like, Doctor Strange 2, where it's hundreds of millions of dollars. And that, I've said it before on the podcast, but that like $60 to $100 million movie is kind of just vanishing at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I do wonder, I mean, I've talked about this on our podcast a little bit too, but, I do feel like I'm a little surprised that we haven't seen tiered pricing at this stage. I'm a little surprised that a movie that, for instance, only costs, $20-30 million, the ticket to that movie could conceivably be less money, right? And if that ticket is cheaper, more people might go and see that film. If a movie costs $200 million, it's not completely unreasonable for that ticket to cost a little bit more money. So I just wonder why we haven't seen, movie theater chains figuring out ways to do that. That's not to say that, as we move forward now with Netflix buying movie theaters, with Amazon buying movie theaters, with the monopoly of these movie theater chains going away and studios being able to do this, we could conceivably see a sea change in terms of the way that people see movies, and that's not a bad thing.
Well, allegedly,
Yeah.
I heard that well, not even allegedly, like it's been confirmed that AMC was doing that with the Batman and Spider-Man. So like that came out, I don't know, like a month ago or something.
No, you're absolutely right. It's definitely on the table now.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how much farther we go with it. I don't necessarily think it's the worst thing in the world. We did an episode on our podcast where we covered every issue of Premiere Magazine from 1999, and there was the first issue, the Millennium issue, there were interviews with George Lucas and James Cameron, and both of them were talking about ticket prices, and they were talking about how more expensive movies should be more expensive to see, and this idea of, now again, of course, Lucas and fucking James Cameron think that people should have to pay more money to see their movies. That's not a surprise, but I do think that there is something to be said for looking. We have this sort of myopic perspective when it comes to all movies are kind of clumped together, and not all movies are built alike. So maybe we should be finding new ways to find, audiences for movies that deserve them. It's unfortunate that we still live in this world where, I don't need to tell you guys, I'm sure you guys, paying attention to box office in 2021, and it was a very strange time, right? Where you had these movies that were being claimed as dead on arrival. And you're just like, well, is it though? There's so many ways for movies to make money, for people to see these movies now. We really can't just base it on an opening weekend in movie theaters. Like, it's just that's a very narrow way of looking at this industry.
Yeah, I mean, if Morbius could be #1 at the box office, yeah, no, it should be telling, like, you shouldn't base it off of opening weekend. You should base it off of overall. But then
and then
also,
too, just like streaming stuff, because especially when you have like, something like Black Widow, and that came out in day and date on Disney Plus, paying $30 for it, and that was why that whole Scarlett Johansson lawsuit happened, is because, okay, like, this movie looks like it didn't make a lot of money at the theaters, but it's also driving A, subscriptions, and B, actual purchases on Disney Plus, that you do have to, like you said, Phil, think about these things in a much different way.
yeah.
When I think that I also think that you have to sort of, you're making a very valid point in terms of the contracts that we make with the various entities and talent involved in these films, right? And these things need to be baked into the numbers now, right? Like the precedent that Scarlett Johansson rightfully set with that specific, I don't even know if it got to a lawsuit. Maybe it did. They resolved it. All things, whatever.
Mhm.
Point is, if you're now an actor, you have to be thinking about, it's not just back end. It's not just, how much money I make in movie theaters or, what have you. They should be given a piece of these profits in so many different ways. It's just a business, and everybody should be seeing it as a business, but it's also the commodification of creativity, right? It's still an art form. And I think that the second we lose sight of that, then we're really doomed.
Yeah.
And there's also the usage, and I know it's like some limited accessibility to it, and then us being where we live in Orange County, we're kind of like blessed with it, but having these indie theaters as well, like independent theaters, like here in Orange County we do have the Frida Theater, and they are the ones that, like, we essentially go to see these, like, mid tier, as you can say, movies, and have that, like, tiered ticket sales as well, because they are slightly lower of their price at their ticket sales, and so I would also hope that, like, utilizing independent film theaters would actually be a good way also to have this kind of tiered box office, as you were saying, because it would allow it to, and grow independent film theaters, which is, like, always a good thing.
Absolutely. I mean, the Alamo, theater chain is doing quite well. We're seeing that expanding across the country, which is great. We finally have one in Los Angeles that I frequent, very often. I think that, the movie going experience, the theatrical experience, isn't going anywhere. It's still the cheapest date. It's still the thing to do on a weekend. It's still, it's not going anywhere. The question becomes ultimately, when do audiences, if audiences, get bored with franchises? You know what I mean? Are they going to still be sticking around when Marvel is on its 40th or 50th movie? Are people still going to be like, I can't wait to see what, I couldn't even tell you the characters' names. But my point is, and I like the Marvel movies just fine, but, once you get really deep down this rabbit hole, at a certain point, like, the repetition of it is just kind of impossible to get away from. And that's the problem with franchises, right? There's a reason why, working in television, most TV shows, seasons 4 or 5 are when people kind of start to tap out, right? You've kind of told all the stories you can tell. You've sort of exhausted all the best opportunities that you can. And there are people that stick around and watch Grey's Anatomy in season 15, and more power to them. That's great for all people involved, I guess. But that just feels like some sort of a, I don't know, mental disorder. But I'll just say that I think that, like, at a certain point, you have to cut bait, right? And you have to change something. And that's the question, whether or not we are saturating the market right now with so many franchises that we're getting to a tricky place. I mean, I think it's ironic we're talking about Peter Jackson right now, who ultimately pretty much broke new ground, right? I mean, the first fantasy film to ever win Best Picture, to win a ton of Academy Awards. That franchise was a game changer, right? And unfortunately, he didn't really kind of have another gear after that, or he didn't really show us what he wanted to do after that. And he still kind of hasn't. I'm not shitting on the Hobbit movies or on Peter Jackson, but I do think that there is something to be said for um, how much he changed cinema and then kind of didn't know what to do with it once he changed it.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really the Lord of the Rings films are some of that, and maybe like Batman Begins, like that whole time period was like some of the most important films ever made, with just the way that movies go and the way it was like, okay, like the Lord of the Rings became like an event you had to go to every year, and then the same, Harry Potter, the Harry Potter films at the same time kind of had that same effect, and now that's why, they're like, okay, well, how are we going to replicate this with the Hobbit movies? It should just probably be one movie, but let's make it an event. Now it's like, okay, you got to go see the next one and the next one, and it just, these things. That's why I love films and TV shows and things that have like a specific end. That's why one of my favorite Marvel movies ever is Endgame, because this is an end to an arc of so many stories. Even though obviously they're still making Marvel movies, it was kind of an end to what they were doing for 10 or 11 years or however many it was,
For sure. I think there's also, the other thing that is worth talking about for what it's worth. Peter Jackson did kind of fuck with frame rate. I mean, that was the thing that he was trying to bring to the table for the Hobbit movies, which is, the higher frame rate, because our eyes can only see a certain amount of frames per second. The films all of a sudden looked like a soap opera. And I don't quite know why he decided that was the hill that he wanted to die on. I don't quite know why Ang Lee tried to do it as well. It does feel like a thing that these, and who knows what James Cameron's Avatar 2 will be released in, if it will be released at the end of this year.
I can't with that move.
But I just think that there's something to be said for these. When you break new ground and then you're just sort of like, well, now, okay, so I'm a trailblazer now. What's the next thing? And when the next thing isn't totally apparent, and instead you're stuck watching 3D or high frame rates or whatever, just make a good movie, guys. Make a good story. I don't, you know what I mean? I'm not so concerned with these technical notions, quite frankly, but I guess that some people are.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're talking about Zemeckis too, and I think he really fell into that same trap. Like there's this video essay by Patrick Willems that talks. It's called Robert Zemeckis and His Magnificent Toys, and it's just kind of how he fell into this trap of like, wow, there's all these technical innovations. I've been driving all these innovations, and that's all that it's going to be. Like where you have something like Welcome to Marwen, which is like, what even is this movie? It's just like about how, or like the Polar Express or Beowulf, and it's, you have all these like dead-eyed like CGI mocap people, and I think Peter Jackson definitely fell into that same thing where his early films, all the way up to probably King Kong, and especially this one, he uses special effects when he needs to, but they all still have all these quote-unquote bigatures and all the like practical effects. And then when it's like, oh, I can just use special effects for everything, so I'll use them for everything. Like look at an orc in The Lord of the Rings, and look at an orc in The Hobbit, and even though those movies are made 10 years later, the orcs in Lord of the Rings look so much better. And it's not to say that like the CGI was better, because it's obviously in 2002 than it was in 2012. It's clearly better in 2012, but when you blend them like that, you just use them to fill in the cracks instead of just paint the whole painting. It works. It works so much better for cinema.
You make a really good point, and I think it's interesting because listen, I think Polar Express, Beowulf, Christmas Carol, those movies suck. I mean, they're horror shows.
I like them.
But I do think that you have to give credit to the first person through the wall, right? They get the bloodiest, right? They're the one that's like, I'm going to try this thing. And without Zemeckis breaking that ground, we probably don't get Avatar to some degree, or at least Avatar being as successful a mocap film as it was to some degree.
Oh, so I could blame
Think motion capture.
Robert Zemeckis for that.
Blame Robert, right? Like, I mean, look at I mean, any of Andy Serkis's, mocap performances, right? They're all tremendous performances. You're able to do it. It's just Zemeckis just unfortunately didn't have the goods at the time. But again, this is all just to say that I think that Peter Jackson is a fascinating filmmaker. I think that this film, it also should be said, and you said this up top, but like this was the last film he did before he does Lord of the Rings, right? So this comes out in '96. Lord of the Rings comes out in 2001. My assumption is they probably shot it sometime in late '99, early 2000
I think they
is when they started shooting them.
in '98, and went '98 to 2000.
Okay.
Oh shit.
Okay, so when you think about it, and then on top of all of that, right, you had false starts. You had the two Weinstein versions where they were getting backed by Harvey and Bob, and they were going to do 2 films instead of 3, and like there were all these kind of false starts before New Line goes all in on Lord of the Rings and lets him off the chain to do what he wants to do. So it's pretty amazing that he comes off of this film, and then he's like, I'm now going to do the biggest fantasy films that ever could possibly be, right? Like, it's just, you got to hand it to the guy. Like, this movie is kind of a failure at the box office, and his takeaway from it is time to sack up and do the biggest thing that's ever been done.
Right, he got a blank check from this movie somehow.
Legit, absolutely.
Crazy.
It also continues the trend that I guess you could say, going back to Peter Jackson and Sam Raimi kind of like started off, but we do continue seeing it to degrees of success of these horror, like technically horror or like mystical like directors and writers kind of coming in and becoming and picking up these very big franchise or big movies and just like doing incredible work on it, like with Peter Jackson and Lord of the Rings, Sam Raimi, and the Spider-Man movies. Then you have like the one that has done it now doing, well, we don't know about the Flash, but yeah. But then also like James Wan or all these other that started their careers in horror element, James Gunn as well. And then I don't know. I really do love. I really want to understand more about how, because it does work, that formula of like a kind of coming from this like low budget horror film genre and like kind of be, I guess, because like I think we mentioned it before of like how doing a horror movie or like this movie like The Frighteners like lends itself to so much creativity that it makes the really great inspirations for further work in that director or writer's filmography later down the line.
I think it's how
for sure. It also.
Oh no, sorry. I was just gonna jump off of Ariel and you, Phil, because you kind of said it earlier. You release like a massive film, like you kind of jump off. Like Ariel was saying, a lot of directors start off in horror, and they kind of get very creative because the budget's so small. So you have to figure out a lot of things, and then you make these big franchise films like Lord of the Rings or the Raimi Spider-Man movies. After that, it's kind of how you were saying, like, what do you do next? You're a trailblazer at this point. So I think when, like, James Cameron and Zemeckis and Peter Jackson, when they say, what do I do next? I feel like maybe they go, I need to keep raising the bar. I need to, like, push the envelope. I need to do something what nobody else is doing. So I think that's why we get these weird Beowulfs and Polar Express, or we get, just these strange, like Sam Raimi's Oz, the Great and the Powerful. That was just filled with CGI to the brim, where even the Spider-Man films would have practical effects and CGI effects when needed, just when Lord of the Rings did it as well. Miniatures and CGI when needed. But I think they try to experiment, and they try and go, hey, let me push the boundaries with this. Let me try and go as far as I can with like this new technology. But I think sometimes it's one of those things, you have all that power in your hand, and you have a studio backing you, so you kind of just go, fuck it. Maybe they get a little lazy. Honest to God, I think sometimes they get a little
You know,
lazy.
I think I agree with what you're saying, and I think it's worth sort of unpacking for a sec that like Peter Jackson does Heavenly Creatures in '94. That's a $5 million budget. He does The Frighteners, which comes out in '96. 2 years later, it's a $26 million budget. And then you've got Lord of the Rings, which is a $100 million budget. All things considered, kind of insane when you think about it. I mean, that movie only cost $100 million is pretty crazy. They obviously split it amongst 3 films, shot them all at once, and all of that. But I do think that um, there's something to be said for he was finally given the keys to the kingdom a little bit, right? Which is Universal Studios gave him $26 million and said, go make a studio picture. And he goes and makes that movie. It's a great movie. And this is, I think, the moment when he's like, I can fucking do this. Like, I think it's more about like, I personally think there's a tactility to it. There's some beautiful production design, all that stuff in the sanatorium at the end. All that set design is fucking great. It all feels very much like the cave in Fellowship to some degree when they're fighting that giant troll monster or whatever. Like it's all very kind of like monochromatic and mossy and very kind of like hazy green gray, what have you. Like you can see a lot of him, a lot of the lessons he learned off of Frighteners and being like, I can take these lessons and apply this to something much bigger. And that's the type of mind that we all love when it comes to filmmaking, which is someone that can think bigger and can think like anything's possible and the world's my oyster and look at what I can do now. And I think The Frighteners is interestingly kind of the skeleton key. It's kind of the thing that opens that door for Jackson to some degree. I'm speculating, but it feels like this is the movie where he's like, okay, I can do this. And he figures, well, now or never. I guess I should back up and do the thing that I've been wanting to do my entire life, which is the Lord of the Rings. It's crazy that he does it, but I mean, God bless him for it, right? I mean, the fearlessness that's required to do something like that is unbelievable. It would have been an enormous disaster.
Absolutely.
And the faith that New Line had were like, okay, we're going to give you this movie and give you it at a level that you've never had before, and we'll let you do 3. Like, not just 1 or 2 like the other studios had, but we'll let you do 3 movies to the point where when, like, Shyamalan, when he was trying to make, who was a very successful director at the time, when he made his last Airbender movie, I mean, they were like, you can make 1, and they were right in doing that, because that movie is horrible. But New Line knew what they had with Peter Jackson.
It should be said though, because the person that probably doesn't get enough credit for Lord of the Rings is Bob Shaye, who was running New Line at the time, right? And Bob Shaye was a producer who he did Nightmare on Elm Street, he did a bunch of horror movies, he was a horror guy. So for him, Peter Jackson walking in the door and saying, I want to make Lord of the Rings doesn't sound insane to him, right? Like this feels of a piece of his kind of headspace. That movie, obviously those movies are enormously successful. Kind of nothing he does after that as sort of the person at New Line is as successful. But he's a fascinating producer, he's a fascinating director and writer, and it's pretty amazing what Bob Shaye was able to accomplish in a very short period of time. But yeah, I mean, it's not sexy. Bob Shaye's not the sexy name. The sexy name is Peter Jackson, obviously. But I think that there's something, the guy deserves his due.
Yeah, definitely. Well, guys, if I can we can pivot back to, because I know early on,
Frighteners.
Phil, you had mentioned some of the moments that you had wanted to talk about in the Frighteners. Is there any particular moments that stuck out to you that you really wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of looking at my notes here real quick, but I do think that there's a couple of things that jump out at me. One of you guys, forgive me, I can't remember which one, mentioned the interrogation scene. I really love that scene between Milton and what a name, Milton Dammers. I mean, just a great name.
Looks like a Milton Dammers.
It does look like a film, and it's a great scene, not just because of the photography, the sort of crazy Dutch angles and all that kind of crazy photography mixed in with those locked off shots of Michael J. Fox, but also Michael J. Fox is really, really good in that scene.
Oh yeah,
he looks old, he looks haggard. He literally looks like he's been to hell and back. again, Michael J. Fox after this movie decides to basically quit movies, pivots back to television, does Spin City for a few years before, unfortunately, his Parkinson's became too difficult for him to work consistently. But it's a shame that we kind of lost him in movies. And it's a shame that he was kind of misused in the 80s and 90s in a lot of ways. Because I feel like Marty McFly is obviously so iconic, but it feels like he tried to do other stuff. He does Casualties of War, the De Palma film. He tries to do Big Lights, Bright City. Like, he tries to do things to show that he has chops, and people just aren't interested in seeing that from him. So it was nice to see this interrogation scene really show him, being a really superb actor. Milton revealing this crazy armor vest that he has under his shirt for reasons that still escape me. I think he thinks that's going to protect him from whatever creature is out
Which,
there.
by the way, real fast, it has nipples, like in the Schumacher Batman movies.
Yeah.
Did you notice that?
Yeah.
I noticed
Yeah.
this. Yeah, I noticed that. And then I was kind of thinking how strange it was that he brings up this case where he's like, oh, this woman was able to kill somebody with their mind. And then he thinks that's what Michael J. Fox's character is going to do. And then he brandishes the bulletproof vest or the lead vest. And I'm like, you just said he'll kill you with your mind.
Well, I think that
you think it's a mind bullet or something?
Yeah, I think it's like the lead will like protect him, but then it's like your mind.
Like Superman can't
your
see through lead.
Yeah, yeah. But also like for me, one of the scenes that stand out to me and I love is that scene in the hospital at the end, and I think that Michael J. Fox just freaking acts that out so awesome, and that whole like, yeah, the last 15 minutes are my favorite part of the movie because of how tense it is, and that's where essentially like that another element of a horror movie, like like this chase kind of happens, and you're being, and then him going in and out of these premonition, or like I guess premonition. Well, no, premonitions before, but
That's the past.
yeah, the past. So like flashbacks
Visions.
and him visions. There you go. Yeah, just visions of him seeing this and back and forth, and like I just love him in that whole scene, and
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I love all that stuff. I think that the film, I think that whole sequence chunk of the movie at the sanatorium at the end is fantastic. I think it's beautifully shot. I love all that sun-drenched weird flashback stuff, those pop flashes cross-cutting back to the massacre that took place years earlier. I love how it all folds into Frank's backstory with his wife and all that kind of stuff. I think all that stuff is great. What I kind of wish is that we didn't have to go to heaven.
Yeah.
The heaven stuff is so lovely bones to me, where I'm just like, dude, you learned nothing from '96. Like, you gave us a whole movie of this, in 2009. But yeah, I get why they did it. I understand. Maybe it was a studio note. Who the hell knows? But I kind of wish that we went straight from the sanatorium to them at the picnic and just like cut out all the heaven stuff. I'm fine with, and I really actually love the moment when Dee Wallace and Jake Busey are, I guess, swallowed by a giant worm-like creature that takes them to hell. That
was what I was going to say, because if you don't get the heaven sequence, you don't get like the ray of light turning into Satan's butthole. Like, it's so great.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I agree. It's worth it. It's worth going to heaven for the hell thing. It's just a little too treacly and sappy, and it kind of bums me out a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is. But all the stuff in the sanatorium is fantastic. I just want to kind of piggyback on what you guys were saying earlier about all of those beautiful high chopper shots flying over New Zealand. New Zealand at this point hasn't been in Lord of the Rings yet. So watching all this stuff in New Zealand, it has just this slightly weird fantasy kind of vibe to it, where you're just like, feels a little off, but like all these beautiful at night chopper shots flying over small town with this grim reaper jumping on fucking cars and rooftops and just like cascading all over this. Like, it's great stuff. Stuff I think that's the stuff that I think probably will stay with me the most, like moving forward, as it has for me, is just the dynamic way that he shoots all that stuff, and then the way that he just doubles down on all of that in Lord of the Rings, right? Like all that just crazy chopper shots all over New Zealand. This is just kind of the baby version of that, and it's just awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, Alan, Ariel, any final thoughts?
No,
Oh,
I think
no.
I think I think the main thing that came out of this podcast is for, new directors or directors out there, just to, like, when you're at a peak, just take a step back. Reassess, regain your, we're fine with you taking a break and stuff to just find your core again. Like, let's get some spiritual, like, find your center one more time, and because that's what got you
Also,
recognition, and that's what we would like. So yeah.
Absolutely.
totally. I want to piggyback on that just very briefly as we wrap up. I think it's the right note to end on, which is, when you're at that place in your career, take risks, have fun. Like, remember what it was about filmmaking that you loved in the first place. Like, when I read all these interviews with these, most of them unfortunately are men, but hopefully there'll be women as we move forward. But, a lot of these guys just being like, they become complacent. You know what I mean? You have to find something that lights that fire for you. And that's why I feel like, the Hobbit movies just must have been such a draining experience in so many ways for him, that I just kind of wish that, listen, Raimi talks about the Oz movie not being much fun either. But I do think that it is interesting. When you're at the top of the mountain, you got to find new mountains, but also just like remember why you climbed the hill in the first place.
Yeah. And that's one thing I will say is why I have undying respect for the Wachowskis, is because they just made whatever weird stuff they wanted, like, for years, for like a decade and a half, and only recently one of them came back to the Matrix. But they were like, even like Speed Racer, like I've talked about this plenty of times, is one of my favorite movies ever, and I know a lot of people don't like it, and I get
It's
why.
awesome. Love it. It's great.
Right?
Absolutely.
And like, even like movies that I like, Jupiter Ascending, I'm like, that's not a great movie, but man, like, they were clearly having fun with it. And as long as you can just like do what you're passionate about, like, I'm all for it,
I couldn't agree more. I think that all filmmakers should take note of what the Wachowskis do. I think that they've proven themselves every time that they put a movie out and everyone's like, I don't get it. And then 10 years later, they're like, oh, right, it was a masterpiece and I was an idiot and I didn't understand it back 10 years ago. And I think that, we should stop coddling audiences, and I think they're smarter than we think.
Absolutely.
And I don't know. I just think that a good story, and I know that it's money, and I know that it's scary, and that there's careers are on the line, and it's a nerve-wracking endeavor. But if you want your stuff to last, you want your stuff to still be talked about in 20, 30, 40 years, you got to take risks. Otherwise, like, these things just become forgettable. And I appreciate that you guys do this podcast, because I think that this podcast, it seems as though its modus operandi is shining a light on movies that haven't been seen, and making sure that people know about these great things that are out there. And I think that more people should take note of that. Not just your podcast, but I think that the films themselves as well.
No, absolutely. That's
podcast,
why we do it,
the
man.
podcast
That's
would
why
be
we do it.
very, very, very nice. We're very appreciative if it's the podcast, but the movie, it's all about cinema, of course, the cinema.
Sure.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, it's a risky endeavor, but like, it's worth the risk. It's worth taking the shot. It's worth taking the swing more times than not. But that's great movies. Don't worry so much about whether or not they're loved in the moment that they come out.
Yeah.
I'll just say one last thing. Nicole Kidman actually said this recently in an interview that I watched with her and Kristen Stewart when they were doing their whole Oscar, campaigns and what have you. And she talked about how she hates the fact that films are based on their opening weekend. She's like, I've made all kinds of films. She's talked about this film Birth that she made, which is a great movie that came out in the mid 2000s. And she's like, that movie didn't do well at all. And I still have people talking to me about that movie. Like, it's got to be about the long tail. It can't be about just when it comes out, because great art isn't necessarily great in the moment that it comes out.
Yeah, and it's also the factor
really well said.
of word of mouth as well, people see it, a few people see it opening night, but then or opening weekend, I mean, but then those people, pass it on if it's that kind of movie, which they pass on and talk about it to the next person, and then it's just like is like exponential growth. It could be like that too as well.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, listen, I worked at video stores through most of my adolescence in film school, and those don't exist anymore, unfortunately. But like that used to be a great way for people to learn about movies, right? They'd go to the video store and they'd ask the video store clerk, "What do you recommend?" Or they'd look at whatever the case might be. Lots of movies that became hits on video that didn't become hits in theaters. It still exists. You can still rent movies. Most people don't, but still, like you still can. And I think that one of the great things about social media is being able to get out there and bang the drum for this movie that you love that people haven't seen or isn't doing well in the theaters or whatever the case might be. So we just all have to keep banging the drum for movies that we love, even if they're smaller movies.
And like you said, Phil, that's kind of our whole deal here on Underrated.
Hell yeah, absolutely.
Like there's because especially for me personally, I'm just always like, there's so many movies. I'm just like, why hasn't anyone seen Eddie the Eagle? Let me talk about it. How can I do that? Oh wait, there's this platform that exists where I can go and talk with my friends about it. So yeah, exactly, man. Thank you. But yeah, I guess that about does it, Phil. You obviously have your own podcast, podcast like it's 1999. Why don't you let the good people know about that and where they can find it?
Yeah, I have a podcast with a fellow TV writer, Kenny Neibart, and I. It's called Podcast Like It's 1999, where we've been exploring every single theatrical release film of 1999, including television and straight to video. And we've been doing it for 4.5 years now. This will be the last year as we wrap up 1999. But again, it was a seminal year for a bunch of reasons. But it's all the things that we've been talking about, which is independent and American filmmakers, foreign filmmakers. It was the cusp of the millennium, and it felt like everyone was just ready to take crazy swings and do great movies and do wonderful things. And we've talked about everything from Talented Mr. Ripley to Election to Audition, Fight Club. We just recently did a Fight Club episode with Karin Kasuma, and we talked with her about the making of that film and how it spoke to her back in 1999 and how it affected her filmmaking. We've had lots of great episodes with lots of great guests, and we also have a Patreon where we've been talking about the films of 1989, and then we just wrapped that up, and we're now doing the films of 2009. So you can find our Patreon at www.patreon.com/podcastlikeits. So that's where you can find that. You can find me and our podcast on Twitter at podcastlikeits, or my Twitter is PM Iscove. But yeah, check us out. I think you'll enjoy it. If you like this podcast, I imagine you will like ours as well.
Yeah, I can definitely vouch for that. It's a great podcast. And I will say, interestingly enough, what we were kind of talking about, how over time, movies do get these different reputations, and how a lot of those movies from 99 have grown. Like, I was listening to your Oscar episode, and just like, these are the movies that got nominated for Best Picture in 99, one of the best movie years ever. And it's like, what's great? What's better than The Matrix? The Cider House Rules. Okay, just like...
That's the thing, right? Where it's like that Oscar year where you're just like, you're telling me The Green Mile was better than Magnolia, for instance? Like, it's just like it just isn't.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, time will tell. Things are. I mean, and this is not to get into a whole Oscar thing, but time is the ultimate arbiter, right? It's the one that shows whether your movie can stand the test of time, or your TV show can stand the test of time. And this podcast that we've been doing, that Kenny and I have been doing, has been not just a lot of fun, but also a great learning experience, and being able to see why films hold up, and why that year was this weird sort of lightning in a bottle. It was really special.
Yeah.
Two things real fast, Phil.
Of course.
Two questions. When you guys do Batman 89, can you give me a call? Or unless you guys have already done it.
We unfortunately did it already, and we had Karina Longworth on for it. So
awesome.
it was a great episode, and she was no offense to you,
No worries.
but we did do that. That was our last episode of the 1989 Patreon, but it was a really special one. So you should check it out sometime. I think you'd enjoy it.
Absolutely will. And second question, I know you guys focus on 1999. And I've asked people this, and it's such a weird thing, and it kind of does relate to Michael J. Fox. And I remember, he was on Spin City, and I remember watching it even as a kid. And then there was when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I remember there was like a special about it. Like it was like kind of like his farewell from Spin City right before they got Charlie Sheen. And I distinctly remember watching that special. I don't know if you ever remember it, or maybe you guys might have covered it. I'm not sure. But
yeah, I mean, I didn't know that it was in '99, but that does make sense. We've been trying to cover as much TV as we can from '99. Kenny, my co-host, has 4 kids, so his bandwidth is a little bit more narrow than mine is. So I try to cover the television stuff as much as I can. But that is a really interesting thing that I'll look into. I mean, I've done some miniseries. We did one on Felicity, Sex and the City, Freaks and Geeks, West Wing. We're going to be doing one on The Sopranos, which aired its first season in 1999. So we'll be doing that near the end of this year as well. But yeah, I mean, Spin City was huge in '99. So I certainly will look into that for sure.
Yeah, no, it was just there was this like weird thing that they mentioned. I don't know if it came out in '99, but I just remember I was watching it at the time, and they mentioned that Michael J. Fox did stunts for fun. And that they thought that was part of what made him get like Parkinson's. Like they kind of blame the scene in Back to the Future Part 3 where like he gets hanged for a moment and then he gets dragged.
Yeah, they talked about. Yeah.
And then they also mentioned that he used to do like stunts for fun. Like I remember seeing this image of him, like he was wearing like I don't know if he was like wearing his suit from like Spin City, and then he was like getting pushed into like a river with like another dude, and like they're just on like office chairs, and I remember that image so vividly, and I remember asking people about it because they said this is part of why they mentioned the Back to the Future Part 3 and that. Yeah. So I always wondered about it, so I just wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's interesting, and I'm just looking here. His last episodes were in May of 2000, so
okay.
I won't be covering on the show.
Dang.
But I'll just say this: I have read those rumors, and so much, unfortunately, is we still don't know about Parkinson's, and I don't think that Michael J. Fox subscribes to, the notions that any of these roles were the reason behind it. But it certainly is interesting, and it certainly is. I mean, as just for what it's worth here, 2 things as I'm looking at these last episodes of Michael J. Fox's on Spin City. The first is that the last one was written by Bill Lawrence.
Because Scrubs.
So, just a slightly successful guy. And the second is that 32 million people watched the episode. So that into consideration. That was a very different time in television when 32 million people live showed up. So, it's a different time. But so there you go.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I just was like,
of course, and thank you guys.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on. Definitely, obviously, had a lot of great conversations about, not just the film, but just kind of all the things that sprung from it. But yeah, anybody out there who's listening, definitely, if you want to check out anything else we've done, we've got a whole back catalog of episodes and stuff. Check us out on all our social media at Undercast Company. We've also got a Patreon, so patreon.com/Undercast Company. So check us out there. We've got tiers as low as $1 a month and get all kinds of bonus episodes. So we're always trying to cook up more things. We've got a couple other podcasts that we do as well. Ariel's got her You've Never Seen podcast where she introduces me or Alan, or sometimes she gets introduced to a new a movie that we really should have seen by this point. I'm working on season 2 for my TV podcast, Gateway Episodes. And then whenever there's a new Marvel thing, I also do a sort of a side podcast called Infinity Stones and Dragon Bones. So if you guys want to hear more of us, first check out podcasts like it's 1999, then check out one of those. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this has been an absolute blast. I really appreciate you guys having me on to talk about this movie. A movie that, does not fall within the purview of our podcast. So it was an opportunity for me to talk about a movie that more people should see. I don't think it's actually streaming anywhere right now. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
you have to rent
Yeah.
it. But
They got my $3.
It's worth,
Yeah,
I was gonna say it's worth the $3.
Yeah.
absolutely.
I was
absolutely.
just
Yeah.
surprised that I didn't own it. But yeah.
So there you go.
Thank you again. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Phil. We
All right, man.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much, guys. It was a
Hi,
blast.
thank you.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Take it easy, everybody. Have a good night. Have a good one.
Thanks for being amazing.